Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Arab Center, Washington, D.C., I'd like to welcome you to this special webinar focusing on Palestinian public opinion regarding recent developments in the region, particularly or specifically the newly announced Arab alliances with Israel. As all of you know, on September 15 of this year, the US President Donald Trump hosted a White House signing ceremony to basically sign a new so-called Abraham Accords, during which the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Bahrain agreed to normalize relations with Israel outside the framework of the usual 2002 Arab Peace Initiative. While hailed in Washington, D.C. and throughout the United States as a historic peace deal, this U.S. brokered series of agreements do not seem, at least from a Palestinian perspective, conducive to a just and lasting peace, nor did they adequately address the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the core of Arab-Israeli conflicts. In fact, as far as the Palestinian public is concerned, they completely ignored the Palestinian people and their perspective on this issue. Today, we are going to focus on that missing ingredient, if you will, or factor, which is Palestinian public opinion and how it views this issue in particular and its implications for Palestinian politics in general. To help us decipher this issue, we are very honored today to have my good friend, Dr. Khalil Shikaki, a name definitely associated with polling in Palestine. He has been a leading pollster and political analyst of Palestinian affairs for quite a few years. His talk will be based essentially on the last public opinion survey he conducted after the first agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel was actually reached or signed. And this is the survey number 77 that was conducted between the 9th and the 12th of September last month by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah, Palestine. Khalil doesn't need an introduction to most of you in the audience, but let me, for the sake of having any new faces in our audience today, that Khalil is a professor of political science. He's the director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, as I said, in Ramallah, Palestine. He is one of the founders of the Arab Barometer and a member of its actually steering committee. He's also a senior fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University here in the States. Dr. Shikaki completed his PhD studies at Columbia University back in 1985, taught for several actually Palestinian and American universities, including Birzeit University and Najah University, the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, the University of South Florida, and so on. Dr. Shikaki has conducted actually more than 200 polls over the years among Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Since 2000, actually, he has also done joint polls, which is very unique. Very few people could claim that. Palestinian-Israeli polls, more than a couple of dozen of those actually that I'm familiar with, to compare, if you will, Palestinian and Israeli public opinion regarding some of these common interests, if you will, or issues of common concern for both sides. And he has authored many articles and several publications on public opinion. His area of expertise has always been Palestine, public opinion, Palestinian state building, security sector reform, transition to democracy in Palestine, and so on. We are delighted to have him as our special guest of honor today to help us, as I said, decipher the complexity of this issue and to factor in the Palestinian public opinion. After all, what is happening or has happened in Abu Dhabi and in Manama and here in Washington and in Tel Aviv impacts most directly the Palestinian people. So it is kind of stunning that the Palestinian people have not been factored in, have not been consulted. So it's good to hear their voice this morning through Khalil Shikaki's findings in this timely survey that he has conducted. What we'll do is give Dr. Shikaki about 20 minutes to discuss his findings in general. I'll engage him in a conversation for a couple of minutes to transition into our normal Q&A session to give you, the audience, the opportunity to chat with him, to raise your questions. Please feel free to use the Q&A format on the Zoom page, or you can email events@arabcenterdc.org, events@arabcenterdc.org, and the questions will be presented to me. I will be, for the sake of brevity, I will be more than glad to read your questions to Dr. Shikaki, and he will be more than glad to answer as many of your questions as possible. So half of our time will be dedicated to Q&A. Khalil, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, Khalil, and with all the guests who are listening in or watching. I intend to talk about our latest survey, probably mention other surveys we have conducted since as well. And in addressing the issue, this issue being the Arab normalization of Israel, I'll say three things. One is, which I hope isn't going to take most of my time, but hopefully I'll go over it fairly quickly, is why Palestinians reject it. I'll say something about the implications of the change that this agreement has made on public perception of Israeli-Palestinian relations. And thirdly, I'll look into how this has affected the domestic balance of power among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I don't need to tell you that Palestinians reject the normalization agreement. The overwhelming majority in our survey, 80% said it's a betrayal or abandonment or an insult. And so a large percentage, an overwhelming majority, does view this very, very negatively. We also found that at least 2/3 of the Palestinians believe that this is a major development, and this is not a simple thing, that will have an impact on the region and on Israeli-Palestinian relations. This is not about two minor Arab countries, in this case Bahrain included. This is more about a strategic shift in the region, that what might be a strategic shift in the region, perhaps one of the greatest successes of the Trump administration, and no doubt a major coup and a success for that administration. There are four reasons why the Palestinians think so, why they think this is bad, and why they think this is a major development as far as they are concerned. One, I'll show a few slides later on, not immediately right now, just few, to give you some examples. I didn't want to crowd the presentation with a lot of slides, but I'm afraid I have to talk about percentages, and so you have to bear with me a little bit. So the first issue is about major Arab allies. This is not about the Emiratis, who are not an ally of Abbas in any case, or the Palestinians. But this is a concern that this is in fact a vote of no confidence in Abbas and the entire Palestinian leadership, not by the Emiratis, by the entire group of Abbas allies, that is Egypt, Saudi Arabia in particular, that these countries supported this, welcomed it, and perhaps in fact did more, helped to design it. So the survey showed that 80% of the public believes that these allies of Abbas are abandoning him. Now, look at what happened when Abbas tried to get a symbolic statement from the Arab League. That also indicated the shift that is taking place. In other words, I think what the public thinks is that this is an important issue because it affects this current alignment of the PA and opens the door for other possibilities. I can, of course, add what happened in the last few weeks with the meeting in Istanbul and with the visits to Qatar and so on, where we begin to see the potential for a Palestinian realignment. That is, this is one of the most important issues for the Palestinian public, that the Palestinians are losing their allies in the region, and at the moment they are without any major allies. The second has to do with what you can call the domino effect, the belief that this is not going to stop with the Bahrain, with the Qataris, with the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, that it could bring additional players, including the Saudis. If you look to the left, we asked, will the Saudis normalize with Israel too? You can see more than 80% said yes. They expect Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel as well. Saudi Arabia is a major ally, and it is going against the views of the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian people. If the Saudis do it, then obviously a lot of other players will go ahead. So this concern about the domino effect is a major concern. There's a third reason the survey shows, and you can see it in this current slide as well. If you move to the right, the question, who benefits from this deal? And this has to do, you can call this the impact on the balance of power between the Palestinians. As in the past, is that the Palestinians are weak. Of course, they are weak compared to Israel, but they have the Arab world to support them and to condition normalizations with Israel with a deal with the Palestinians that establishes a state based on 67 lines, Jerusalem as capital, and so on. So you have this kind of reliance on the part of the Palestinian leadership on this Arab backing as a way to help redress the imbalance in the relationship with Israel. But as you can see, 86% in this survey said Israel is the one that benefits from this deal. Only 1% said the Palestinians benefit, and 8% said both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, benefit from this. Clearly, the concern of the Palestinians about this issue is one of the factors that have led to this overwhelming rejection of the deal. There is one more thing we asked about in the survey, although we didn't directly link it, but it's obvious from the survey that they are linked, and that is the context. In what context are they normalizing relations? And the concern of the Palestinians is that it is the context of the Trump plan, the Trump peace plan, the link to the annexation, postponing annexation or suspending annexation, and it is one thing that the Palestinians consider to be like embedding the deal in the Trump plan. Yes, they are postponing annexation, but it is within the context of this plan. In this survey, 90% of the public rejected the Trump plan. Since the plan was released, we have conducted several surveys in which we asked about the plan, and it's been very clear that there is a Palestinian consensus that this plan doesn't meet the basic needs of the Palestinians. And so this normalization is seen in that context. Most Palestinians do not believe that the issue of annexation, which has been presented as an achievement for the Palestinians by the Emiratis, that they should be happy that this has been done. The overwhelming majority of the Palestinian public doesn't believe that. It doesn't believe that annexation is off the table. They believe it has been postponed, maybe a few months, maybe after the elections. Nobody knows, but it's still there. And they believe that because of that, because it is still there, because it hasn't been removed from the agenda, Netanyahu refuses to say it is off the table. Israel will act as if annexation is coming, which means the actual creeping annexation that has been going on for a long time will only accelerate right now because of that. So that is the link to the Trumpist plan and the public concern that it not only, this deal not only comes in the context of that plan, which the overwhelming majority of the public rejects, but that it will also mean a significant campaign to expand settlements and to confiscate Palestinian land and so on and so forth. Before I leave this issue, I want to say two more things about it. This is a major concern because of the domino effect and because the Palestinians are losing their traditional allies, and they don't have other allies right now to rely on. It doesn't mean that the Palestinians are giving up on the Arab, in the Arab community, in the Arab countries. The masses of the public, they are not. Majority, only % is giving up. 57% are not. The rest are not certain, understandably, but clearly a clear majority is not yet. And secondly, this is not to say that the Palestinian public does not put some of the blame, a lot of the blame, in fact, on its own leadership and its own failures. More than 60% believe this is a failure of Palestinian diplomacy. More than 50% believe that our division, Hamas and Fatah, West Bank and Gaza, the fact that we normalize relations, even though we still don't have a peace agreement with Israel, even though Israel is occupying us, and we are normal. We clearly say that there is more than half of the Palestinian public thinks that we share the responsibility for this. Okay, so what is the impact? Normally, every time something happens, major thing happens, a threat of annexation, the Trump plan, war in Gaza, the deal between the Emiratis and Israel is one of those major things that happen. We try to assess immediately, to try to assess the immediate impacts on these two things. Are the Palestinians today more or less willing to compromise with Israel? Are they more or less willing to support diplomacy versus violence? And so on. So we look at the impact on Israeli-Palestinian relations. Obviously, we can't say with certainty that A leads to B or causes B. I'm not pointing an arrow for causality. Our survey shows tremendous correlation, but not necessarily causation. So if I say impact, I mean it in that sense, in the sense that there is strong correlation that we're looking at with regard to the peace process, and secondly, with regard to the domestic environment. So the next slide will show the impact on the peace process. This is the support for the two-state solution that we have been monitoring I'm just showing you, we've monitored this for 27 years, by the way. What you're looking at is the last decade, and you can see September is highlighted separately, and September is the latest survey, and it is compared with the average for the years. So what you're looking at is percent supported it. By the way, if you just go 5 years earlier, this was 70%. And before that, there was a time in which 85% of the public supported the concept of a two-state solution. But by 11, Netanyahu in power and Israeli-Palestinian relations are worsening. And clearly we see the drop to 55%. No doubt, compared to where things were in 2019, there is a significant decline in support for the two-state solution. We take this to mean less willingness to compromise among the Palestinians. And although I'm not showing a slide of what I'm about to say, we did conduct additional surveys in which we went over the basic compromises required in a two-state solution, something that we've been asking about for the last at least 17 years, and they show a significant drop in the willingness to compromise regarding every single item we presented in the package that we usually look at, a package that implements a two-state solution. If you see 39% a minute ago in the slide, if you look at where things are with regard to a package that implements a two-state solution, the support, and of course that package includes all kinds of compromises that the Palestinians in the past accepted. In the current situation that I'm talking about, we see significant decline in the willingness to compromise. This, by the way, was a joint Israeli-Palestinian survey that we have just completed, and will soon be releasing the data. And it showed on the Israeli side a significant hardening of attitudes as well. So the Israelis have become hardliners, and the Palestinians have become hardliners. Now, again, I can't for sure say it's the normalization deal. But because we conduct these surveys every quarter, we look at what happens in that quarter, and the normalization deal has been the most significant development that happened during that period. A second element that we look at when we look at the peace process is what alternative solutions. Now, if you look at the next slide, you will see that we're looking at support for the concept of a one-state solution. A one-state solution that we present in these surveys is one in which Israeli Jews and Palestinians have equal rights in a single state in the entire area between the river and the sea. So this is what we are presenting to the Palestinian public, and we clearly see now what you're looking at is the average for 20. What you see is 42%. That's the average for 2020. What I showed you earlier was the support for September in particular. This shows a continued increase in support over the years, in support for a one-state solution, and that, I think, is the where we see particularly the youth heading. If the younger you are, for example, in our survey is the youngest age group that we look at, those between the ages of 18 and 22. You will find the greatest level of support for the one-state solution among this group, and the least level of support, the lowest level of support for the two-state solution among this group. If you go a little bit up to 30 years, you'll find it a little less, but the trend is very clear. The younger you are, the more likely you abandon two-state solution and support a one-state solution. I want to move to the next slide, and this one looks at how Palestinians, why Palestinians reject the two-state solution. And I put this because what I want to say is, even though I've just said there is continued decline and there is less support for compromise, and there is clearly a support for a one-state solution on the rise, it is possible, indeed likely, for this to change back to supporting a two-state solution if a two-state solution, as Palestinians understand it, 6 to 7 lines, Jerusalem, East Jerusalem as capital, and so on, a real sovereign state. If Palestinians come to the conclusion that that kind of two-state solution is feasible, they will support it. If you look at what I'm showing right now, you'll see that there is a group to the left in blue and red, where this group thinks a two-state solution remains feasible. For them, support for the two-state solution is almost 70%. If you look at the other two columns to the right, this is a group that thinks the two-state solution is not feasible. This, by the way, this group that thinks it is not feasible is about 2/3 of the Palestinian public. And the exact picture to the left is right there on the right, but the colors are different. Because support becomes opposition and opposition becomes support. So that tells me that one of the major drivers for rejecting the two-state solution is because Palestinians reach the conclusion that the kind of state they have in mind is no longer feasible. The next slide addresses the last issue that I wanted to address, and that is the impact on the domestic side of things. This is a question that we have been asking for many, many years. Since the end of the term, actually before the end of the term for Abbas, we started to ask about the Haniyeh. Ismail Haniyeh, as you know, is the leader of Hamas. He is the most popular leader of Hamas, by the way. Other Hamas leaders are not as successful in gaining public support. You can see in this survey that has been dropping, so I'm not going to again say this is there is a causal relationship between the two. There is correlation. If we look at those who are not voting Abbas, you will see that they are the most critical of the deal with the Emiratis and the most concerned about it. But the survey shows Haniyeh at his best. We have never had Haniyeh at 52%. Never, in any survey in the past. This is the first time that we got a 52% for Haniyeh. Now, for Abbas, by the way, this is also the lowest we have ever seen. Not only in averages per year, but in any single survey, when only Haniyeh and Abbas are competing. Abbas' popularity is not that great, and 39% actually is great for him, given the fact that much less than that are satisfied with his performance or would vote for him if somebody else was on the ticket. If Marwan Barghouti, for example, who is serving several life sentences right now in Israeli jail, if he is put there as a third candidate, the vote for him would be the highest, Abbas would be the lowest, Haniyeh would be second in line. If you just put Haniyeh and Barghouti would win very, very easily with 60 to 65% of the vote. This is what we have been finding for more than a decade. And so clearly there is something that is happening that affects Abbas in particular. It does not necessarily affect other Fatah or nationalist leaders in terms of the competition between Fatah and Hamas. In fact, in this particular survey, we didn't find significant decline in support for Fatah versus Hamas. If anything, in fact, Fatah improved slightly. Hamas didn't gain, but it is Haniyeh and Abbas. So I can say that probably Abbas is paying the price for perhaps having too much trust in his Arab allies, and the public is basically saying to him, you have led us astray. You and your allies are destroying changing the balance of power and so on. Of course, Abbas would have been even weaker had he not taken a very strong position against the deal, against the normalization deal and the Trump plan and so on. The fact that he did take a strong position seems to have helped him and have helped Fatah as well, but not enough. There's no doubt that he is paying some of the consequences. This again is my own speculation about the finding. I'm not showing here, the data isn't showing a cause and effect relationship. With this, I want to thank you, and I'm happy to answer your questions, Khalil, and the questions from the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Shikaki, for your excellent presentation. I think the information that you just gave us is very informative and very instructive with regards to the issues that are at stake here. I think I am personally a little bit clearer, more clear than when we started with where Palestinian public opinion is. And it's unfortunate that it hasn't been factored in by policymakers who are trying to kind of change the politics of the region, yet they kind of ignore the main party to this conflict. Let me start with just a couple of verifications, actually, because you did partially answer these questions. The first one, definitely, I agree with you and with the findings of your survey that there has been definitely a lot of anger and disappointment on the part of the Palestinian public with regards to these agreements and concern for the future. But based on your 17 plus years of experience in polling these types of issues, are the Palestinian people, the public, is that public taking this issue more seriously than usual, considering the existential nature of these developments?
They are, although obviously they have to worry more about annexation and they have to worry more about the Trump plan. And so there is no doubt, and they have to worry about their own domestic conditions. Their economic conditions are worsening. The suspension of relations with Israel is causing a great deal of pain and suffering in many ways. So all these things are happening simultaneously, and so they take this seriously because of the larger strategic picture, but they are also consumed with their daily living conditions that are worsening, and they are worried about what's happening with their own political system. There is a great deal of discontent. The demand for Abbas resignation is very high. The evaluation of the performance of the government is going down after a good rating that the government received in June. By September, all of that was lost. So I would say overall, they are very worried about it. But when you look at all the other worries that they have, I would say it is probably not the top one.
One more verification. You did allude to it or actually discuss it in some details. You know, the rationale by some of these countries like the UAE, Bahrain, even Sudan, that seems to be moving in that directions, keep mentioning the fact that they are doing this as a favor to the Palestinians. Yet the Palestinians are reacting kind of almost like in the opposite direction. Is there any segment in Palestinian society that is receptive or is taking seriously these claims by the normalizers that they are doing this to help the Palestinians, first with the postponement of annexation, but also in the future in terms of they keep stating that they are for a Palestinian state and that the Palestinians need to engage, as we just heard from just the past 48 hours from Prince Bandar bin Sultan, condescendingly suggesting that it's the responsibility of the Palestinians to show more leadership and more initiative at this time.
Well, I actually do agree that we, the Palestinians, must show more leadership and more initiative. On that, I agree. I don't agree with everything else he said, but on that point, we cannot wait for the American elections or for the next Israeli coalition. We must act on our own and take the initiative. The answer is, if the Emiratis actually think they did this, in part at least, for the Palestinians, they say more than that. They have not convinced the Palestinians of that. The survey clearly shows maybe there are 10% of the Palestinian public who thinks there is something good about this, looking at the entire situation. But the overwhelming majority of the Palestinians are not buying this narrative that the Emiratis are doing it for the Palestinians, or that they, in fact, have succeeded in getting something from the Israelis. The perception is that the Emiratis might have been perhaps a little bit of a factor in postponing, but not in removing the question from the agenda. And as I said, for the question of annexation. And for Palestinians, what they worry about is not only the legal annexation, it's the creeping annexation that happens every day. The more settlements, more land confiscation, more home demolition, that is their daily life. This is what they worry about. And in fact, if anything, they are now more concerned about that because they think, well, the right wing in Israel that has agreed to postpone needs now to show its commitment to the right-wing agenda, and that means greater work on the ground to deprive the Palestinians of the opportunity to build their own state in the future.
All right, let's move to the questions that we received from our audience. The first question is from Ori Neer, Peace Now. And Ori would like to have a little bit more information regarding the proportion of Palestinians shifting from, let's say, or supporting one state versus two states. You did allude to it, you did show a slide. How strong is that in terms of like the different age categories? You alluded to the fact that it's very strong among the first category, the young people. Could you expand a little bit more on that?
Sure. The shift is happening very slowly. So in 2020, we did see a significant change in that direction because the Trump plan was announced, annexation was announced, and now normalization. So you put all that together, you get a situation in which people just come to the conclusion that this is not going to happen, a two-state solution. We need to look for something else. And of course, they realize that a one-state solution, one democratic state, isn't more feasible as a result of negotiations. They think the right wing in Israel has agenda. This agenda is to ensure that the entire region between the river and the sea is an area of full Israeli control. And so settlements and military presence and so on, which rules out the possibility of a two-state solution. It becomes less practical day after day. So in their eyes, Israel is creating without, well, realizing what it is doing, of course, but without negotiating with the Palestinians, what Israel is doing is to create facts on the ground that consolidate the prospect for a two-state outcome in the future. And so they go in that direction with this kind of understanding. The youth now in particular do that. Well, we find for two reasons. One has to do with their age. They were not raised during the heydays of the Palestinian national movement. Their own perception of the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian national movement is not a positive one. They think of corruption, of authoritarianism, and that is not the kind of life they want. There is absolutely no doubt that good governance, a democratic political system with free press, periodic elections, independent judiciary, and of course independent and pluralistic civil society are the things that Palestinians youth more than anybody else insist on. Palestinian youth are definitely much more liberal, much more committed to democracy than older groups. This is one reason that we see this unhappiness with where the Palestinian leadership is taking the Palestinians. And so in their eyes, a two-state solution will create a corrupt and authoritarian Palestinian state, even if negotiations are successful. So they can be easily convinced to move away from the two-state solution in favor of a one-state solution. Of course, they realize in focus groups with the youth, we can see their full realization and determination to fight for equality and to fight for their rights in a context in which what is happening on the ground is a one-state reality. Percentage-wise, support among the younger generation for the two-state solution is about a third or less. Support for the idea of a one independent, one democratic state is somewhere between slightly less than 40%. Maybe today it is already 40%. I have not checked lately, but the last time I checked, it was closer to 38 or 39% in favor of a one-state solution. Probably slightly a little bit more than that, but I do not have the figures right in front of me, Ori.
The next question comes from Hassan Shawaf. It's related to what you just stated. Is there any room to consider a peace plan with two federated states with one central federal government? It seems to me that there is room between the option of two states and the option of a single unitary state. Your comment.
We have been asking about the idea of a confederation for at least a decade, and we do find some support for it, but it is either equal or slightly less than the support for one democratic state. So and most of the support for the confederation, in fact, comes from the supporters of the one-state solution. There are some who support both ideas simultaneously, and they too support the idea of a confederation. But it's somewhere, I think today it is somewhere between 30 to 35% that are willing to support that. However, if the idea is, if this is a two-state solution, but Israelis and Palestinians interact together in a peaceful environment, in a much more extensive manner, perhaps with open borders, economic relationship, and so on, we do find significant public support for that. There is significant support for the idea of continued interaction between the two sides, even after a Palestinian state is created. We don't find similar level of support for this among Israeli Jews, but among Palestinians, we do find significant support for all kinds of interactions between the two sides once a two-state solution is created In fact, we find a lot of those who reject the two-state solution are willing to shift and support a two-state solution if it comes, for example, with open borders, where Palestinians have the ability to travel to Israel, work in Israel, live in Israel, and so on, as Palestinians, not to become Israeli citizens, but as Palestinians.
The next question comes from Andrew McInnes. Do you think the Palestinian people, Khalil, underestimate the benefits to them of a peace settlement? Are the Arab countries maybe more objective in articulating the potential benefits here than the Palestinians?
Well, the most important thing for Palestinians is ending occupation. This is the point of departure. Anything that ends occupation will find Palestinian support. Building a state is something that comes next to ending occupation. 6 to 7 lines, East Jerusalem, and so on, is what a state means. But the most fundamental issue is ending occupation. For them, so they are willing to suffer in order to get to the end of occupation. The Arab countries, if their interest is for the Palestinians to show more flexibility and offer more compromises, if that comes within an understanding of the deal of the century, then I'm afraid for the Palestinians, the deal of the century does not end occupation. And so the reaction of the Palestinians, the 90 to 95% rejection of the Trump plan, is essentially about this: the belief that this plan does not end the Israeli occupation. Everything else is secondary to this realization that unless it ends occupation, it is not bringing peace.
We have a question from Mohannad Salhi regarding the first slide that you showed, Dr. Shikaki, particularly on the issue of those who believe that the UAE Israel deal somehow is beneficial to the Palestinians. That segment, that number that Palestine is beneficial to Palestinians or to both Israel and the Palestinians. What exactly are these benefits that they are referring to?
Well, we haven't asked that question. My guess is that they do buy into that narrative. That I said earlier, there are about 10% of the Palestinians, maybe slightly more, who think there is something positive about this. Even if they reject it, they are willing to acknowledge that there is something positive about it, and this is the group that are highlighted, that I highlighted, the 8% and the 1%, who do think that Palestinians gain. My own interpretation of this is that they think that the annexation is probably off the table. This is not the thinking of the overwhelming majority of the Palestinian public. But if you do think that annexation is off the table, and of course, I mean, this is some people did make the case, including the Emiratis, that this is indeed what they have been trying to do, and you can read in the Israeli press, and the Palestinians do read the Israeli press because it's translated into their own newspapers, and they can read it every day. And there are a lot of Israeli analysts who actually do say that annexation is now off the table. I happen to disagree, for example, and just like the 90% of the public who do think that it is off the table. But for the right wing, annexation is not something that happened today. It's something that Netanyahu and the Likud and other right wing factions in Israel have been building towards. They have created a reality on the ground with everything they're doing that is only driving in that direction. You can postpone it a little bit here or there, but eventually this is what's going to happen. There will be annexation, sooner or later. And what the Arab countries are doing will probably be pushing in that direction.
Mitchell Plitnick would like to know if there is any difference between the West Bank and Gaza in your findings with regard to the Palestinian concern over these accords that the Emiratis and the Bahrainis use to establish relations with Israel.
There are differences between the West Bank and Gaza on this issue, but there are minor differences. The percentages are very big for both sides. We do occasionally find differences between the West Bank and Gaza when it comes to some of these issues that are the issues related to the peace process, Israeli-Palestinian relations, or the regional environment. There are more differences when it comes to issues of support for violence. Gaza is more likely to support it. Gaza is less likely to support a two-state solution. On the Emirati deal, there are very minor differences between the two. On the question of one of the actors that we've asked about as having a role is Dahlan. We asked about Dahlan's popularity and whether he might have been involved in helping to articulate as an architect of this, or at least as a player. And the answer for most Palestinians is yes, I think that is the case. But in Gaza, we do find that Dahlan has a base of support, mostly among Fatah supporters in Gaza. And that is not the case in the West Bank. So because there is greater support for Dahlan in Gaza, his role in all of this in Gaza is denied, unlike the case in the West Bank.
All right, we're going to try to squeeze the remaining questions in the few minutes remaining. If you don't mind kind of limiting your answer to 1 minute each, we can maybe squeeze 4 or 5 more questions. The first one is from Marianne Lanatza from Lund University in Sweden. How do the Palestinians look at the Jordanian or Moroccan reactions respectively?
We have not asked about Jordan in the current survey, but I can tell you from previous surveys that the Palestinians do differentiate between the role of Jordan and the role of Egypt and Saudi Arabia, for example. And what we see is that there is much more appreciation for the Jordanian position and a belief that Jordan is still in supporting the Palestinians and would not switch its position, unlike the way Palestinians think of other major Arab players, including Egypt, by the way. Until recently, Egypt, particularly in Gaza, has been considered to be an ally and a supporter. In this survey, clearly this is gone. And but again, because I haven't asked about Jordan in the current survey, I don't really know exactly where the attitudes are in light of the Emirati deal. My guess is that the Palestinians do not think that Jordan is abandoning the Palestinians or even abandoning the Palestinian leadership, unlike these other Arab countries.
Nabil Khouri sends his greetings and asks, have you polled directly on the potential of violence as a means of achieving a Palestinian state? I know you gave some options in the questionnaire, including probably armed struggle. Would you care to answer Nabil's question, please?
Sure. I'm glad to hear from you, Nabil. I hope you are doing well. We ask about support for violence, armed struggle, a second intifada, suicide attacks, everything that you can think of. Not in every single survey, but in most of the surveys, there is one or more questions about this. In the current survey, the support for, and in fact, for the last 3 years at least, we have not seen a majority in favor of violence, with the exception of one time when the Trump deal was announced. At that point, we did see a significant rise in support for violence as the means not to end the occupation, but to defeat the Trump plan. In the current survey, we're somewhere between 35 to 45%, depending on how we phrase it. We try to phrase the question about support for armed struggle or violence in ways that can help us assess where the public is. Sometimes, for example, we ask about it just sort of standalone question about support for violence. But most of the time, we give people various options to break out of the status quo or to end Israeli occupation, what is the most effective means, and so on. There is no majority today in the current surveys in favor of armed struggle as the means to end occupation. You'll find slightly more support for that in Gaza, actually a lot more in Gaza, sorry, but slightly more in Gaza, but slightly more support for violence as the means to break out of the current status quo. The current status quo is rejected, but it doesn't mean that all of those who support it believe it can end Israeli occupation. So I would say we're somewhere around 40%, slightly more, slightly less, and we have been there for a long time, with that one exception I described earlier, in terms of the role of violence in Israeli-Palestinian relations.
Saeed Ariqat from Al-Quds newspaper would like to know, how do you go about surveying Israelis on either the two-state or the one-state options?
Good to hear from you, Saeed. I'm happy to hear from you, and I hope you're doing well. It has been a long time. I haven't seen you in a long time. We ask Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs in an identical way we ask Palestinians, because we want to know how the two sides view this. So when we ask about the concept, Saeed, we simply ask about what we would tell people to be what is known as the two-state solution. This is not enough, of course, for us. We want to know whether people, when they say yes or no, know what they're talking about. So we describe the two-state solution in as many details as possible. And for the two-state solution, overall, those Israelis and those Palestinians, Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, and Palestinians who answer these two questions about the package and about the concept do seem to understand what a two-state solution is about. The overwhelming majority of those, 75 to 80%, do understand what this is about. So when Israeli Jews say we support a two-state solution or oppose it, they do understand what it is in a similar way that the Palestinians understand what it is. I know some people say, well, Palestinians say this, what they have in mind is something that is very different from what Israelis have in mind. That is not the case. This is not what our surveys are showing. The surveys are showing that both sides realize what a two-state solution is, and they answer the questions about the concept. They do understand what it is, but not all of them, but the overwhelming majority of them. And this doesn't mean that those who support the concept are necessarily fully in support of the compromises that come along with it in the package. So you'll see that there will be an automatic decrease in support for the two-state solution when we are talking about the package of implementation. That is less, in other words, that will be less than what we find when we simply ask about the concept.
You referred during your talk to the need for more Palestinian leadership in terms of being more diplomatically proactive. In a follow-up question, Ori Nir would like to know, with the remaining couple of minutes, what are the type of diplomatic initiatives that could be recommended at this time?
Well, I think we need to, not just diplomatic initiatives, but a lot of other things we need to do. But on the diplomatic front, I think the day Trump announced his plan, we should have responded by a counter plan, a counter detailed plan. One is as detailed as his plan, and we should have done that in full cooperation with the Egyptians, Jordanians, and Saudis, so that they can be the architects with us of this detailed plan. We didn't need to wait for Trump to announce his plan. We have known that it was coming, and we had some ideas of what it will contain, and that it will be detailed with a map and so on. We needed to immediately capitalize on that moment when the plan was released, so that we would have a counter proposal, immediately a counter proposal to neutralize the Trump plan and to mobilize the international community behind our plan, and to tie the hands of our allies, the Egyptians and the Jordanians, who have now abandoned us. We needed to do that. Abbas needed to be seen as active and not waiting for everybody else, and not to simply say, I reject the plan out of hand. He had the right to do so. This is unbelievably unacceptable. But our response should have been in terms of our own counter proposal, and that, I believe, would have also helped us with the Israelis, where we, I think, are not doing enough to reach out to the Israeli public. I know Israel is going right wing. We cannot avoid our own responsibility for that. And we need to reach out. Our leadership needs to reach out to the Israelis, the minimal kind of reaching out. I think we need to, and that plan, our own plan, would have been one way of reaching out to the Israeli public, not just to the international community, and not only to tie the hands of our Arab allies and so on. I think we need to be a lot more active on these two fronts.
Thank you, Khalil, very much for spending this hour with us. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your experience and sharing the findings of this important survey with us. And thank you to all the participants who joined us today. And we invite you again to join us in future webinars on Middle East issues focusing on the Arab world. The video of this survey will be posted on our website as soon as possible, as soon as some of the editing is completed later today or tomorrow. And we remain in touch, so you stay in touch with Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Thank you very much.
Thank you.